The morning Wren Calloway was thrown out of Dalton Grigg's ranch house, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and the girl didn't even own a coat. She stood in the hard-packed dirt of the yard with nothing but a flour sack dress, a pair of boots 2 sizes too big that she'd stuffed with newspaper to keep from slipping off her heels, and a canvas bag holding everything she owned in the world. 2 books, a paring knife, a tin cup, and a photograph of her mother. She was 15 years old. The man who was supposed to be her guardian stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, a stream of tobacco juice darkening the wood of his own porch step, and looked at her the way a farmer looks at a fence post that's rotted through and needs replacing with impatience and a vague irritation that the thing had not lasted longer and saved him the trouble. "Girls can't cook," Dalton Griggs said. His voice had the flat certainty of a man who had never in his life been asked to justify a single thing he believed. "Girls can't do nothing useful. Your daddy owed me money and I took you on to settle the debt, but you ain't worth the food I put in your belly. Get out." It was November of 1934. In the high ridge country of eastern Tennessee, in a narrow valley the old-timers called Hatcher Hollow, and the Great Depression had turned even kind people mean. The mountains had always been hard country, thin-soiled and steep, far from the railroad lines and the government offices, and the modest prosperity of the river valleys. But the 1930s had made hard into something approaching impossible. Families that had been managing in the careful and self-sufficient way of Appalachian people were now genuinely hungry. Men who had never asked for help were standing in relief lines. Women were feeding their children by skipping their own meals. The social fabric of the hollow, which had always depended on a kind of reciprocal help among neighbors, was being pulled tight by too many hands reaching for it at once. Dalton Griggs had not been softened by any of this. He was the biggest cattle rancher in Hatcher Hollow, a man who owned 3,000 acres and the loyalty, or more precisely, the fear of everyone in the valley. When he said a thing, people accepted it as fact. Not because Dalton was wise or educated or possessed of any particular insight into the nature of things, but because in Hatcher Hollow in 1934, a man with 3,000 acres and 100 head of cattle and the social standing to foreclose on a neighbor's farm simply did not need to be wise. He needed only to be certain, and certain he was about everything. And what he had been certain about from the day Wren Calloway arrived at his ranch was that she was a problem. She was strange, he said. She spent too much time reading those books her dead father had left her. She asked too many questions about things that were none of her business. She had opinions about cooking, about how things ought to be seasoned and timed and prepared, that went beyond what was appropriate for a girl her age doing work she owed him. She was not grateful enough or obedient enough or plain enough in her ways to suit the uncomplicated arrangement he had in mind when he'd agreed to take her on. He had wanted a servant. He had gotten something that made him vaguely uneasy. And vague unease in a man like Dalton had a way of becoming contempt. But Wren didn't know yet. Standing in the frozen yard, the full truth of why she was being thrown out. She would figure it out later on the mountain in the cold, with enough time and silence to think it through. For now, she only knew what he'd told her, that she was worthless, that she was a thief, that no one in the hollow would take her in because he would make sure of it. She picked up her canvas bag, turned north, and walked away without looking back. Not because she wasn't hurt. She was hurt in the way that only happens when someone who was supposed to protect you turns out to have been calculating their own advantage all along. not because she wasn't afraid. The mountains in November with no coat and worn-out boots, and $2 she'd saved over 2 years by going without things she needed were a genuinely frightening prospect. But she had learned in 2 years under Dalton Grigg's roof that some men feed on the sight of a girl breaking, and she would not give him that satisfaction, no matter what it cost her. She walked without looking back, and she kept her shoulders straight, and she did not cry until she was far enough up the ridge that the ranch house had disappeared below the tree line, and she was certain he could not see her. Then she stopped behind a large oak and pressed her forehead against the bark and cried for about 3 minutes. It was the last time she cried about Dalton Griggs for a very long time. To understand what Wren Calloway carried with her out of that frozen yard, besides the 2 books and the paring knife and the tin cup and the photograph, you have to understand where she came from. Not Hatcher Hollow, not the ranch. Further back than that, her father, Silas Calloway, had been a school teacher in the Hollow for 20 years. A lean, quiet man with ink-stained fingers and a quality of attention that his students described years later as the feeling of being taken seriously. He had a habit of picking up interesting rocks on his walks and pressing them into the hands of the people around him with the instruction to look closely and think hard about what the rock could tell you about where it had been and what had happened to it. He collected books the way other people collected debts constantly, with more optimism than the available space warranted, filling every surface of their small cabin, with volumes on botany, geology, natural history, and what he called the science of living things. He believed with the simple and uncomplicated faith of a man who had seen the practical results of knowledge in his own life, that understanding the world around you was the most useful skill a person could develop, not useful in the abstract, not useful as a cultural ornament, but useful in the immediate and specific sense of knowing how to do things, how to solve problems, how to look at a situation and figure out what was actually going on. He had passed this belief to his daughter along with everything else, the books. The habit of observation, the conviction that asking why was not impractical, but essential. Her mother, Opal Calloway, had been something else entirely, though something that complemented Silas's approach so completely that Wren had grown up thinking of them as 2 parts of a single way of seeing the world. Opal was by the firm and consistent consensus of everyone who had ever sat down to eat at her table, the finest cook in 3 counties. But this description, accurate as it was, failed to capture what made her remarkable. There were plenty of competent cooks in the mountain communities of eastern Tennessee, women who could produce solid, nourishing food from whatever was available, who had a reliable repertoire of dishes and the knowledge to execute them. Opal was not merely competent. She was what you would call in the vocabulary of a later time a genius of her particular craft. She understood food the way a great musician understands sound, not just as raw material to be processed into something edible, but as a system with its own logic, its own cause and effect, its own beauty. When the elements were properly understood and properly combined, she knew why things worked, not just how to do them. She could taste a dish and tell you what it needed with the precision of a diagnostician, not because she had memorized rules, but because she understood the underlying principles from which the rules derived. She taught all of this to Wren with the same patient attention that Silas brought to his lessons, beginning with the simplest things and building carefully from there. never moving on until the previous layer was solid. She taught her that bread was a living thing, that the yeast in a sourdough starter was a population of organisms that needed tending the way a garden needed tending, regular feeding, the right temperature, attention to its health and activity. She taught her that fat was a carrier of flavor, that acid was a brightener, that salt did not simply season food, but transformed it chemically, drawing out moisture through osmosis, breaking down proteins, changing texture and flavor in ways that went far beyond mere saltiness. She taught her to smell as well as taste, to listen to the sounds a cooking pot made and hear the information in them, the difference between a simmer and a boil, between caramelization and burning, between a bread that needed more time and one that was done. She taught her that most cooking mistakes were not failures of execution, but failures of attention. And that attention was a skill that could be developed like any other. By the time Wren was 10 years old, she had been cooking real food with real responsibility for the results for 2 years. She could identify 40 species of wild mushroom by sight and smell, and she could explain the identification criteria for each one in enough detail that someone could have used her explanations without seeing the mushrooms themselves. She had kept a sourdough starter alive for 2 years, feeding it every morning with the same regularity other children fed pets. And she knew its moods and rhythms the way you know the mood of something you love. She could explain why vinegar made pie crust flaky, why browning meat before braising it produced deeper flavor, why a proper stock needed to start in cold water and why it should never boil. She was in the vocabulary of a later century, a prodigy. In the vocabulary of Hatcher Hollow in 1932, she was a peculiar child who asked too many questions and spent too much time in the kitchen when she should have been outdoors doing something useful. Then the typhoid came. Typhoid fever moved through Hatcher Hollow in the autumn of 1932. The way hard weather moves through a mountain valley, fast, comprehensive, and entirely indifferent to what it destroyed. It had been a wet summer, and the water sources that several families shared had been compromised somewhere upstream, though no one was entirely sure where or by what. By the time anyone understood what was happening, a dozen families had sick members. By the time the worst of it passed, 6 people in the hollow had died. Silas Calloway was sick by the second week of October. He had been visiting a family whose children were the first to fall ill, and the timing suggested the visit had been the exposure, though. In a community where water and food and living space were shared as freely as they were. In Hatcher Hollow, the question of exactly who gave it to whom was largely academic. He ran a fever for 4 days before Opal sent for the doctor in the next town. And the doctor came and confirmed what Opal already knew, and went away again because there was nothing to be done except keep the sick person hydrated and pray. Opal nursed Silas with the methodical attention she brought to everything, keeping him cool when the fever spiked, keeping him warm when the chills hit, getting water and diluted broth into him by whatever means was available, sleeping in short intervals beside the bed. So she was there when he needed her. She did not rest. She did not eat properly. She was sick herself by the 3rd week of October, before Silas had fully recovered, and she was sicker faster because she had run herself down in the nursing. Silas sat up in bed and watched his wife with the helpless anguish of a man too weak to do anything useful, and clear-eyed enough to understand what he was seeing. By the 1st week of November, both of them were gone. Wren was 13 years old. She sat in the empty cabin for 3 days before anyone came to check on her. She spent those 3 days doing the only thing that felt both manageable and necessary. She cleaned the cabin completely and thoroughly, the way her mother had taught her, washing every surface, airing the bedding, scrubbing the floors. She made herself meals from what was in the pantry, simple things, and she ate them because her mother had taught her that you ate whether you felt like it or not, because a body that wasn't fed couldn't do what needed doing. When the neighbors finally came, there was an uncomfortable conversation among the adults of Hatcher Hollow about the future of the school teacher's peculiar daughter. Most families were already managing more than they could comfortably handle. The depression had been grinding at them for 3 years, and an extra child was a serious addition to a household's burden, not a minor inconvenience. Dalton Grigg's offer had seemed straightforward at the time. He had space. He had food. He wanted help around the ranch, and Silas Calloway had owed him $18 for a load of fence posts, and taking the girl on as household labor was a reasonable way to settle the debt. Nobody looked too closely at the terms because nobody had a better offer to make, and the girl needed somewhere to go before winter closed in. So Wren went to live at the Griggs Ranch. She took her father's books and her mother's handwritten recipe notes, and the photograph that had sat on the mantel since she could remember Opal in her Sunday dress, unsmiling with the particular dignity of a woman who understood the gravity of the moment, even if she hadn't entirely liked the photographer. She packed these things into the canvas bag, along with a change of clothes in the tin cup from the kitchen shelf. And she went. For 2 years, she scrubbed floors and hauled water, and split wood and mended fences, and cooked plain food because Dalton Griggs had a theory deeply held and frequently expressed that fanciness in cooking was a character flaw. He wanted his food plain and hot and plentiful, and he wanted it on the table at the times he specified. And he wanted no commentary on the subject from a 13-year-old girl who thought she knew something about cooking because her dead mother had filled her head with nonsense. The one time Wren had tried to add wild thyme and garlic to a beef stew herbs she'd gathered herself from the hillside herbs that would have made the dish genuinely good rather than merely adequate. Dalton had picked up the pot and carried it to the back door and dumped the whole thing out onto the frozen ground. Then he'd come back inside and looked at her across the kitchen and said, in the same flat, certain voice he used for everything, "Don't put on airs in my kitchen." She did not try again, but she kept foraging. In the hour before the ranch work began each morning, while the sky was still gray and the frost was still heavy on the grass, she walked the woods above the ranch and gathered what she found. Ramps in the spring, pawpaws and hickory nuts in the fall, watercress and wood sorrel year-round, where the springs ran. She had learned from her father's books and her mother's kitchen that the land around Hatcher Hollow was full of edible things that most people walked past without seeing. And she had been walking through these woods long enough to know where most of them were. She ate some of what she gathered herself discreetly away from the ranch, because Dalton had opinions about the eating habits of the people under his roof, and wild gathered greens were the kind of thing he would have classified as fanciness. And she began leaving the rest carefully parceled on the doorsteps of families she knew were struggling. A bundle of ramps in the spring, a bag of hickory nuts in the fall. In the depth of winter, when the wild things were mostly gone, a small pot of mushroom soup she made before dawn from dried mushrooms she'd stored through the fall, carrying it wrapped in her apron to keep it warm. She never left a note. She didn't want credit. She was not doing it because she wanted something in return. She was doing it because she had been taught by people who were no longer alive, but whose teaching persisted. Regardless, that feeding people is one of the most fundamental and important things a person can do, and that the fact of hungry children in a community where food existed was a problem that someone should address. She was someone. She would address it. The trouble was that people noticed and people talked. By the fall of 1934, the quiet word going around Hatcher Hollow was that someone was leaving food. Good food, carefully prepared. Food that tasted like somebody knew what they were doing on the doorsteps of the most struggling families in the valley. People had theories about who it was. Some of the theories were right. None of them were voiced aloud in the presence of anyone who might report them to Dalton Griggs, because even people who weren't sure about the source of the food knew instinctively that Dalton would disapprove of it. And disapproval from Dalton was not a minor social discomfort. Dorothea Sloan ran the dry goods store at the crossroads in Hatcher Hollow and maintained what she would have described if asked as a careful awareness of community affairs. She was not malicious. She was simply constitutionally incapable of holding information without sharing it. And she had long since stopped distinguishing between the information that was safe to share and the information that was not. She heard the talk about the food on the doorsteps, and she put it together with what she knew about who cooked in the valley and who was particularly skilled, and she arrived at a conclusion that seemed both obvious and charming. And she shared it with Dalton Griggs one afternoon across her store counter, in the tone of someone paying a compliment. "Folks are saying real nice things about the cooking coming out of your household," she said. "That girl of yours must have some real talent." Dalton said nothing in response. He bought his tobacco and left. That evening he came home and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Wren with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not exactly. Something more precise than anger. The look of a man who has identified a problem and is calculating how to eliminate it. The next morning, before the sun was up, he told her she was a thief. Told her she'd been taking money from his strong box and silverware from the chest and food from his kitchen and giving it away to people in the valley to make herself look good. Told her he'd been too patient, too generous, too much the Christian gentleman, and it was time to put an end to it. None of it was true. Wren knew it wasn't true. And standing in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light, she also understood for the first time the full geometry of her situation. She had been useful to Dalton as long as she was invisible, as long as her cooking was simply something that happened in his kitchen, something that reflected on him as the provider of the household. The moment her cooking became visible, became a thing that people in the valley knew about and talked about and valued it, stopped being useful to him and became a problem. She was not being thrown out because she had failed. She was being thrown out because she had succeeded in a way he hadn't authorized. He told her he would tell everyone in the hollow she was a thief and that no one would take her in. He told her this matter-of-factly, the way he told everyone everything as a simple description of the way things were and would be. Wren picked up her canvas bag. The books were already in it. The paring knife, the tin cup, the photograph. She had been packing it in small and careful increments for 3 days, ever since she'd seen the expression on his face the evening before, and understood what was coming. She walked out of the kitchen and across the frozen yard, and north up the mountain without looking back. North was the Smoky Ridge, a wall of forested mountain that rose above Hatcher Hollow, like the edge of another world. The ridge had never been farmed because the slopes were too steep, and the soil too thin, and the growing season too short for anyone to have found it worthwhile. A few families had logging rights to sections of the timber, and hunters worked the deer trails in season. But for most of the year and most of the day, the ridge above the hollow was empty of human activity. No one went up there who didn't have a reason. Wren followed the deer trails through bare stands of oak and hickory and hemlock, climbing steadily as the morning light turned from gray to pale gold. The newspaper in her boots soaked through within the first hour and froze shortly after, so that each step made a faint crackling sound, and her feet went from painful to numb with a speed that alarmed her. She stopped every 30 minutes to remove her boots and bend her toes until she was sure they still responded, and then she put the boots back on and kept going. She had a rough idea of what she was looking for. Her father had taken her up the ridge twice in her childhood, once to see a goshawk nest he'd found, once simply to look at the view from the top. And she had a memory of water, a creek somewhere on the upper slope, and of limestone outcroppings where the ridge was steepest, places where the rock broke through the surface of the hillside in pale cream-colored shelves and walls. Limestone country meant cave country, her father had told her, where the rock was soft enough to dissolve water, carve channels and chambers and rooms underground. She was looking for one of those rooms. She found it late in the afternoon when the light was going flat and gray, and she had been on the mountain for most of 6 hours, and her legs were beginning to do the particular trembling that indicated a caloric deficit she could not afford. The cave was behind a curtain of dead Virginia creeper, long bare stems hanging from the limestone face like a tattered curtain, and she might have walked past it if the air hadn't changed as she approached. Something warmer, drier moving out from behind the vines. The breath of the underground where the earth holds its temperature constant through every season. She pushed the vines aside and stepped in. The cave opened wider as she moved deeper into it, 12 feet across, at the entrance widening slightly, before narrowing again into a second chamber, about 40 feet back. The floor was dry packed earth. The walls were limestone pale and smooth, marked here and there, with the faint mineral staining of ancient water. The light from the entrance was enough to see by barely, and it was warm. Not the warmth of a fire or a heated room, but the steady, reliable warmth of the deep earth. The temperature that rock maintains, regardless of what the air above it is doing, the warmth that makes caves feel like a held breath in both the coldest winter and the hottest summer. To Wren, who had been cold for 6 hours and whose feet had stopped feeling like a part of her body, it was the most welcome temperature she had ever experienced. She set her canvas bag down on the dry floor of the inner chamber and stood still for a long moment, breathing slowly. She was alive. She was warmer than she had been. She had water nearby. She'd heard the creek below the cave on her way up, and she had, for the first time in a very long time, a place that was entirely her own. Then she saw the iron hook. It was in the back wall of the inner chamber at exactly the height where you would hang a pot if you were cooking over a fire on the floor below it. The iron was old and heavily rusted, the surface rough with oxidation, But the hook itself was solid, driven deep into a crack in the limestone, with the kind of deliberate permanence that communicated clearly and without ambiguity that whoever put it there had intended it to last. Beside it, scratched into the pale stone with something sharp, a knife point, she thought, or a nail, were two initials and a year. CP 1903. Someone had lived here. Someone had come to this cave in 1903, 31 years before Wren stood in this same chamber and built fires and cooked food and driven an iron hook into the wall for hanging a pot, and had left their initials as proof, as communication to whoever came next. Wren ran her finger over the scratched letters. The limestone was cool and slightly rough. She thought about the person who had made these marks, the deliberateness of it, the intention. You didn't scratch your initials into a wall unless you meant something by it, unless you wanted someone who came after you to know that you had been here, that you had survived here, that this place was survivable. She didn't know who CP was, but the hook was solid, and the cave was warm, and those facts together meant something. They meant this place had sheltered someone in need before her, and that someone had thought enough of the next person to leave a hook behind. She took that as a good sign. She settled in for the night. The first 2 weeks on the mountain were the hardest of Wren Calloway's life, and she had already lived through the deaths of both her parents and 2 years of unpaid labor under a man who had resented her existence. She survived on what she could find. The last of the fall's hickory nuts, dried persimmons still clinging to their branches, watercress from the creek bank. She set snares from bent saplings and strips of bark, checking them every morning with a focus that had nothing to do with sport and everything to do with the simple mathematics of survival. She nearly died 3 times. The first time was a fall on an icy slope above the creek on her 4th day. She went down hard on a shelf of exposed limestone, the gash opening from just below her knee to halfway down her calf. She lay in the snow for 10 minutes, making a series of extremely calm calculations about whether she was going to be able to get up. She got up. She found sphagnum moss along the shaded creek bank. Her father's books had mentioned its use in wound care, packed the wound with it, wrapped it tight with a strip torn from her dress hem, and did not check her snares for 2 days. The second near death was cold, pure, and simple. 3 weeks in the temperature dropped overnight to something below what the cave's natural warmth could adequately counter. She lay on the floor of the inner chamber and shook for hours, not the controlled shivering that the body uses to generate heat, but the deep, uncontrollable shuddering of a body that has been cold too long and is beginning to lose the argument. She talked to her mother, not out loud exactly, more in the interior way that the mind talks to itself between sleep and waking. She described food in specific and detailed terms. A beef and root vegetable stew braised for hours until the collagen broke down. A sourdough loaf pulled from a real oven with the crust shattering when you tapped it. Apple butter simmered down with spices until it was the color of dark amber. She talked herself through the night, thinking forward instead of backward, and by morning the temperature had come back up enough to be survivable. The third near death was water. She drank from the creek at a point downstream from where a deer carcass had been deposited by a predator and left to decay. The stomach cramps that followed were severe enough to prevent her from standing upright for 2 days. She lay in the cave and thought at considerable length about the relationship between water quality and survival, which her mother had mentioned in passing and which she was now understanding in the most direct possible terms. After that, she built the filter, a section of hollow log packed in layers from bottom to top, clean creek gravel, fine sand, crushed charcoal from an old fire site she'd found on the hillside. Water poured through the top emerged from the bottom clearer and cleaner. It was not perfect, but it was better, and she did not get sick again. The filter was the first thing Wren Calloway built on the mountain. It would not be the last. She studied the cave the way her father had taught her to study everything, with patience and attention, and the willingness to sit with a question until it answered itself. She noticed that the crack in the ceiling of the inner chamber created an upward draft when she held a burning twig near it. The cave breathed. If she built a fire in the right position directly below the crack, the smoke would follow the draft upward and out, while the heat radiated from the walls and stayed trapped inside. She had reinvented, without knowing the technical term for it, the principle of thermal mass. The same principle that made old stone churches cool in summer and warm in winter, that would later be studied and written about in agricultural journals by people who had never heard of Wren Calloway. She built a fire pit from flat river stones carried up from the creek, positioned directly below the natural chimney. She cured it slowly with small fires before trusting it with anything larger. The smoke drew perfectly. The heat filled the chamber like water fills a vessel. Then she made pots. Her father's books had described how certain indigenous peoples of the southern Appalachians had crafted cooking vessels from soapstone, a soft, carvable rock found throughout the region. She found a deposit about a mile from the cave and spent 3 days chipping and scraping with her paring knife and a piece of flint until she had 2 rough but functional vessels and a broad, flat cooking stone. She fashioned a cutting surface from a poplar slab, sanded smooth with creek grit. She wove baskets from white oak splits. She built a sleeping platform from green hickory poles raised off the cold ground layered with dried leaves and cedar boughs. The cave was becoming, in a primitive but genuine sense, a home. She made her first real meal in the new kitchen on a December evening, just before the solstice, when the dark came down by 4 in the afternoon. A rabbit from her snares, dried mushrooms from a fallen log, wild onions from the creek bank, hickory nuts, and a careful pinch of the salt she'd been rationing since leaving Dalton's kitchen. She combined everything in the soapstone pot with filtered water, simmered it for an hour, added a sprig of dried mountain mint she'd found wedged in a crack in the cave wall, left there, she imagined, by CP whoever they were. She served it in the tin cup she'd carried from Dalton's house, sat on her sleeping platform, and cried. She cried because it was good. The sweetness of the wild onions had deepened into something savory and rich. The mushrooms had given the broth a depth that was almost meaty. The rabbit was tender. The hickory nuts added a faint bitterness that balanced the sweetness in exactly the way her mother had always talked about the importance of contrast, the way a dish without shadow was flat. It tasted like something her mother might have made on a cold evening in their cabin with the fire going, and her father reading at the table and the smell of good food filling every corner. She had made it entirely by herself in a cave on a mountain with a soapstone pot and a tin cup, and nothing but cold and darkness for company. And she was alive, and the soup was good. She sat for a long time after she finished holding the empty cup in both hands, feeling the last of its warmth against her palms. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees. Inside, the fire settled into coals, and the limestone walls held their heat. And somewhere deep in the mountain above her, something dripped steadily into still water. She was going to be all right. She didn't know yet what all right was gonna look like. She didn't know yet about the bread oven she would build from limestone blocks, or the woman she would become, the one the newspapers would one day call the cave cook of Smoky Ridge. She didn't know about Cornelius Pruitt or Emmett Calloway, or the hundreds of people who would sit at her table in the years to come. She just knew that the soup was good, and the fire was warm, and she was 15 years old. And she had built this with her own hands and her own mind, and no one, not Dalton Griggs, not anyone in Hatcher Hollow, not the whole weight of a country grinding itself down in the worst economic catastrophe in its history, could take that from her. The man who came to the cave in January of 1935 arrived without ceremony, following a line of small footprints in the creekside snow to their source, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been tracking things in these mountains for 30 years and knew there was no particular rush about it. He was 73 years old, built low and broad with a white beard trimmed close to his jaw, and a face that had been shaped by decades of outdoor work into something weathered and particular, like a piece of wood that's been handled long enough to take on the character of the hands that handled it. His own hands were the most telling thing about him, large and scarred and deeply stained. The kind of hands that carry their history in them, that can't be washed clean of what they've done, because what they've done has become part of their structure. Hands that had been in fire and grease and cold water for 50 years. Hands that had made 40,000 meals on a moving train. He was Cornelius Pruitt, known to everyone who knew him as Cobb, and he lived in a cabin about 2 miles east of the cave, and he had noticed someone had been taking watercress from the stretch of creek he thought of as his, not by any legal claim, but by the claim of long familiarity of having gathered from that particular spot for 20 years. He stood at the cave entrance and looked in at what Wren had built. Not the quick assessment of someone cataloging a situation, but the slower, more careful attention of a craftsman looking at another craftsman's work, following the logic of each element, understanding why it was where it was. He looked at the fire pit positioned below the natural chimney. He looked at the filtered waterlog, its layers visible in cross-section. He looked at the soapstone pots, the woven baskets, the sleeping platform raised off the cold ground, the drying rack where strips of dried meat hung in the warmth above the fire. Then his eyes moved to the back wall of the inner chamber, to the iron hook and the scratched initials beside it, and something in his expression changed. He walked to the wall and put his hand on the hook. His hand was large enough to close around the iron almost completely, and he held it for a moment with his eyes closed. And then he looked at Wren, who was standing at the back of the chamber, with her paring knife held down at her side. "I put this here in 1903, he said. "Took me half a day. The limestone kept splitting the wrong direction when I drove the pin." Wren lowered the knife the rest of the way. "Who are you?" "Cornelius Pruitt. Cobb mostly. I've got a cabin about 2 miles east." He looked at her with an expression she recognized after a moment as genuine curiosity. Not the curiosity of someone assessing a situation for its usefulness or its risk, but the simpler curiosity of someone who has encountered something interesting and wants to understand it. "You built all this yourself?" "Yes." "The water filter, too?" "Yes." "The charcoal layer is smart." Where'd you learn that? My father's books. He nodded slowly, still looking around with that careful attention. Your fire pit is positioned exactly right. The thermal mass effect is real, you can feel it. But your soapstone pots have uneven walls. The thinner side takes heat faster, so you'll get hot spots. You'll need to rotate them on the fire. Wren looked at her pots. She had noticed the uneven cooking and attributed it to the fire. I'll make better ones, she said. You'll get better at it, he said with the neutral acknowledgement of someone stating a fact. Now tell me, how old are you and what are you doing on this mountain? She told him. Not all of it at first, the basic facts. The arc from her parents' deaths to Dalton's ranch to the morning she'd walked north. She was not someone who had ever narrated her own life to strangers, and the experience felt strange, as though she were reading from a document about someone else. But Cobb listened without commentary or visible judgment, and by the time she finished, she had told him more than she'd intended. He had sat down on a rock near the fire, while she talked his walking stick across his knees and his hands folded over it. And he stayed like that a moment after she finished looking at the flames. I was 39 years old when I came to this cave, he said. Turned 40 before I left. Different story from yours. Same mountain. He told her about the Southern Railway, the 30 years he'd spent cooking on its dining cars. The craft he'd developed out of cooking in a space the size of a generous closet, while the floor moved under his feet. He told her about the winter of 1903, when he'd filed a formal complaint about the working conditions in the railway's kitchen cars. The hours, the pay differential between himself and the white cooks. The systematic exclusion of experienced men like him from the better-paying routes. He had filed it knowing it would cost him his position. He had filed it anyway because there are things a person cannot stay silent about and remain themselves. The dismissal had come in January, leaving him in the middle of the Tennessee mountains with considerable skill and no immediate way to apply it. He had found the cave the same way she had, following the warmth up the slope, pushing aside the dead vines, stepping inside. I lived here January to April, he said. Then I found work at a logging camp up the ridge. The foreman cared about results and nothing else, and feeding 40 men 3 times a day on minimal supplies was something I could do better than anyone available. 2 summers there and I'd saved enough to build the cabin. He paused. I drove the hook in before I left. Figured whoever found this place next would need it. The cave has a way of finding people who need finding. It found me, Wren said. It did. He looked at her directly. I want to be clear about something. I'm not here to take you back to the Hollow, and I'm not here to tell you what to do. You've clearly been managing without anyone's advice. He gestured at the cave. But I've got a cabin with a root cellar and a pantry, and I'm a better-than-average cook, and there are things I know that aren't in your father's books. If you want supplies and company, I'm available. If not, I'll stay off your section of the creek. Wren thought for a moment. Can you get me salt? He came back 2 days later with a pound of salt, a small sack of flour, a jar of dried navy beans, and a cast-iron skillet. He said he had a spare of. Wren was fairly certain he'd bought it new. It had none of the seasoning that comes from years of use. She didn't say so. She thanked him and gave him a bowl of the mushroom broth she'd been simmering all morning. And they sat by the fire and ate. And the conversation that followed was unlike anything she'd had since her parents died. He knew things she didn't. The hobo bread he'd learned from men who rode the freight trains, a dense, satisfying loaf, made in a cast iron pot, buried in coals, leavened with baking soda and buttermilk, ready in under an hour. The art of smoking meat refined over decades. The wood species, the relationship between temperature and time. The difference between cold smoking and hot smoking. How to render lard. How to make vinegar from wild apples. How to cure a country ham in a cool space over months, until the interior developed a flavor that fresh ham never had. She knew things he didn't, and this surprised him more than she'd expected. She knew the science not from formal schooling, but from her father's books and her mother's kitchen. She explained why the hobo bread worked the reaction between baking soda and the acid in the buttermilk, releasing carbon dioxide. She explained what was happening when meat browned, the chemical transformation of proteins and sugars under high heat, the hundreds of new flavor compounds produced. She told him why a splash of vinegar at the end of cooking could brighten a whole pot of beans, the way light brightens a dark room. Dark. Cobb listened with an attention Wren found unusual in anyone, and remarkable in someone his age. Not polite attention, but real engagement. The kind that leaves marks. He would stop her mid-explanation to ask a question, then connect what she'd said to something he'd observed in 58 years of cooking, and describe the connection out loud. He was learning genuinely and without self-consciousness from a 15-year-old girl in a cave, and he gave no indication that he found anything unusual about it. "Your mother and father must have been extraordinary people," he said one afternoon after she'd explained the chemistry of vinegar making while they worked a batch from wild apples. "They were," Wren said. He didn't offer sympathy, which she was grateful for. He just nodded and they went back to work. The bread oven came from a chapter in one of Wren's father's books, a section on traditional French country baking, with diagrams of the clay and stone domed ovens used in rural France. The principles explained in enough detail that someone with building skill and patience could construct one. Wren had studied the diagrams many times. Cobb, when she showed them to him, looked for a long time and then said, "We can do this." They spent 3 weeks on it. The oven went up near the cave entrance where the morning sunlight fell in a long shaft during the winter months. They hauled limestone blocks from an outcropping on the hillside, Wren carrying what she could, Cobb carrying considerably more, and fitted them into a rough dome with the clay and ash mortar Wren had developed. 3 feet wide at the base, 2 feet high at the crown, with a low opening just large enough to slide a loaf inside on the flat poplar peel Cobb carved. They cured it slowly, burning progressively larger fires over a week to drive out the moisture without cracking the stone. Wren watched the curing fires with an attention bordering on anxious. This was too much work to lose to impatience, and she was rewarded with an oven that cured cleanly. The sourdough starter she planned to use had been developing since her 3rd week on the mountain. She'd caught the wild yeast from the air, the way her mother had taught her, building it slowly into an active, reliable culture. The starter had a character unlike any she'd worked with before. Sharper, more complex, with a minerally undertone she found difficult to describe. The wild yeast of Smoky Ridge was not the yeast of the Callaway cabin. Yeast populations were local things, expressions of a specific place, and this place had its own. On the morning of the first, baking a clear, cold day in late February, Wren fired the oven before dawn. She burned a sustained fire in the dome for 3 hours, feeding it, with the dry hardwood they'd split through the fall. When the limestone glowed faintly, and she could feel the heat from 18 inches away, she swept the coals out with a bundle of green branches, loaded the loaves on the peel, and sealed the opening with a flat stone. She and Cobb sat outside in the thin winter sunlight and waited. When she pulled the first loaf out 40 minutes later, it was golden brown at the crown, deeply colored on the bottom, and it made a hollow sound when she tapped the base, the sound bakers call the sign of a well-baked loaf. The crust was not merely brown, but deeply complexly colored, blistered and spotted from the steam, both crackling crisp and faintly chewy. She cut it open, and they both looked at the crumb. It was open, genuinely, dramatically open, large, irregular holes, connected by a web of chewy, translucent gluten strands. The crumb of a bread that had fermented long and slow in cool conditions that carried in its interior the record of the hours it had taken to become what it was. Cobb picked up his piece and ate it without butter, without anything. And Wren ate hers the same way. And for several minutes, neither of them spoke. The bread tasted of the starter, that sharp, complex, minerally character unique to the wild yeast of this mountain. It tasted of the wood-fired heat of the long, cold fermentation. It tasted most fundamentally of the place that had produced it, and the hands that had shaped it. Cobb laughed until he had tears running into his white beard. "I cooked for governors," he said. "I cooked for a man who had been president of this country. I've been cooking for 58 years. He shook his head. "I have never, not once, baked bread this good." "The starter is what makes it," Wren said. "The starter is part of it." He looked at her directly. "The person is the rest. The starter belongs to this mountain, you're right about that. The yeast, the minerals, the water. You can't make this bread anywhere else, but you can't make it without you either. This bread is yours as much as it's the mountain's. Don't ever forget that. Plenty of people will try to tell you your gifts belong to someone else. They don't." She cut another slice and handed it to him, and they ate bread in the February sunlight and talked for 3 hours. Through the spring and summer and fall of 1935, the cave kitchen grew. Wren terraced the hillside below the entrance building. Low stone retaining walls, and filling the pockets between them with dark alluvial soil, carried up from the creek bottom, mixed with ash from the fire pit. She planted ramps and mountain mint and wild garlic transplanted from the forest, and the garden seeds Cobb acquired from the feed store in the next town, where he was known. And she was not kale turnips, winter squash beans. She saved seeds from the strongest plants at the end of each season. She built a smokehouse from stacked limestone with a green timber roof. She built a spring house over the small seep below the cave, a stone-enclosed space where the cold spring water kept the milk and butter and soft cheese from the 6 goats Cobb negotiated for from families in the settlements above the hollow. The inner chamber of the cave, holding its steady 55 degrees through every season, became an aging room crocks of sauerkraut and fermented beans and pickled ramps in the back corners, rounds of pressed cheese on shelves of flat stone hams, and bacon hanging from hooks. She added to the ceiling following the example of CP in 1903, building the infrastructure of survival, one iron hook at a time. By the autumn of 1935, the cave kitchen was producing more food than 2 people could eat. The decision to feed others was not really a decision. It was a recognition that something she had always done even at Dalton's ranch, even as a child watching her mother cook. was available to her again. There were families in the hollows above Hatcher Hollow who were hungry. She had food. The connection was not complicated. Cobb knew these families. He'd lived in the mountains for 30 years and had spent much of it being useful in the quiet, practical ways of someone who understands. The community requires maintenance. He began taking food from the cave on his visits back to his cabin. Loaves of bread, jars of preserved vegetables, smoked fish wrapped in bark, and leaving them with the families he knew were in the most need. Word spread the way it always does in mountain communities, slowly through networks of trust tested before being extended. By the winter of 1935, people were making the trek up to the cave. They came hesitantly because accepting help from a 15-year-old girl living in a hole in the mountain was not an easy thing to do with dignity. And dignity, even when you are hungry, is not something most people can simply set aside. Wren had thought about this. She'd felt the difficulty of receiving help herself in those first weeks. So she didn't offer charity. She offered education. "I don't want to just feed you," she told the first group of women who came standing in the outer chamber near the bread oven with her hands in a ball of dough. "I want to teach you how to do this yourself, so you can go home and feed your family and teach your neighbors, and eventually none of you need to come up here at all." The kitchen days became a regular institution through the winter and into 1936. Women learned to make sourdough. Wren gave each of them a jar of starter to take home. She taught the principles of food preservation, acidity, and temperature, why some foods needed heat processing and others could be safely fermented. She showed them how to build a cold frame from salvaged lumber and old window glass to extend the growing season. She taught them to make vinegar and soap and simple herbal medicines from the plants that grew wild on the ridge. She took the children foraging, turning the walks into science classes. Identification ecology, the relationships between plants and their environment. She was stern about the difference between certainty and probability in mushroom identification, because her father had taught her that 90% confidence was insufficient when the consequence of error was death. By spring 1936, she had taught bread making to 40 families and sent starters home with all of them. By fall, the starters had propagated women sharing portions of their thriving cultures with neighbors, and the bread that emerged from those kitchens carried in it the wild yeast of Smoky Ridge, the character of the mountain, and the knowledge of a 15-year-old girl who had been told she couldn't cook. Dalton Griggs heard about it in the winter of 1937. Dorothea Sloan had it from her cousin's wife, who had it from a neighbor who'd been to the cave kitchen herself and come back talking about bread that made people cry, and a girl who knew things about food nobody in the hollow had ever heard of. Dorothea told Dalton because Dorothea told everyone everything. He went white. The winter of 1937 was one of the hardest in a decade, and Dalton's circumstances had been deteriorating in ways that made the news particularly unwelcome. A disease had moved through his cattle herd the previous spring and killed 60 animals. 3 of his tenant farmers had abandoned their leases and left the county. The general store at the crossroads had closed in November, leaving the hollow without a commercial center of any kind. The people of the hollow were hungry and frightened, and they were no longer particularly interested in maintaining their customary deference to Dalton, because deference is a transaction, and the thing they got in return had been shrinking for years. When the word spread that the girl Dalton had thrown out, the girl he'd called a thief and a witch, was up in the mountains feeding people for free, Something shifted in the valley. Dalton tried to stop it. He told people the food was probably unsafe. He called Wren a mountain witch, a term that carried real weight in the more conservative corners of the hollow. He invoked with less success than he expected the authority of his long-established word. But hunger has a way of overriding prejudice. Through that bitter winter, family by family, the people of Hatcher Hollow climbed the ridge to see for themselves. Cobb died in the spring of 1938 on an evening in late April, when the redbuds were blooming along the creek and the air was thick with the smell of new earth. He went quietly in his sleep in his cabin. Having spent the previous day at the cave, helping Wren plant the second set of terrace beds, and eating 2 bowls of the lamb and bean soup she'd been developing all week. The neighbor who found him the next morning said he looked entirely at peace, a man who had finished what he came to do and knew it. He left everything to Wren. The cast iron cookware seasoned by decades of use into surfaces as smooth as polished stone. The recipe notebooks he'd kept since his railway days, 12 volumes in a small, precise hand, and a letter on 2 sheets of lined paper. He wrote that she was the finest cook he had ever known, and that he had known many. He wrote that the cave was hers now in every sense that mattered. He wrote about what made her unusual. Not her skill, which was remarkable, but her understanding of what food was for. He wrote that he had been cooking for 58 years, and she had taught him things in 3 years that he had been doing by feel for decades without understanding. He ended with an instruction simple and direct. Don't ever stop. Wren read the letter sitting at the bread oven they had built together in the cold February of 1935, in the morning light of a May day with apple blossoms drifting in through the cave entrance and the smell of the day's first baking filling the air. She read it twice, then folded it and put it in the tin cup that had come from Dalton's kitchen the morning she left, and that sat every day on the shelf of flat stone above the fire. For the first time since her mother died, she did not need to talk to the dead, to feel their presence. The knowledge they had given her was alive in her hands, and the knowledge Cobb had added to it was alive there too. And that was enough. More than enough. The people of Hatcher Hollow came up the mountain through the winter of 1937 and found what Dalton Griggs had told them they would not find. He had said there was nothing up there worth seeing. A filthy cave, a strange girl doing God knew what with herbs and stones. Food that might not be safe, produced in conditions no responsible person would trust. He had said this with the confidence of a man who had been the primary narrator of his community's reality long enough that being believed had become a reflex. What they found was a kitchen, not in the metaphorical sense of a place where food was sometimes made, but a kitchen in the full and specific sense. A space designed and built and organized around the work of feeding people every element chosen for a reason, every tool placed by the logic of how it was used. The kind of kitchen that communicated in its arrangement and its cleanliness and its thought-through functionality that the person who built it knew what she was doing at a level beyond technique. The terraced gardens showed green through the snow. Under cold frames, the salvaged window glass Cobb had found at an abandoned greenhouse 2 ridges over, and Wren had hauled back in sections the previous fall. Kale and spinach and winter greens grew under the glass in defiance of the January cold, the beds warmed by the slight greenhouse effect and a packed layer of straw. Inside, the organization was comprehensive. Rows of preserved food on the poplar shelves, jars of tomatoes and beans and apple butter and sauerkraut. crocks of fermented vegetables, rounds of aging cheese, smoked hams, and sides of bacon hanging from the ceiling hooks, filling the cave with a low, steady, savory smell. The bread oven warm near the entrance, the cast iron pots gleaming with the dark sheen of iron that has been well used and well tended, and the bread. The bread that had come down the mountain in the hands of the women Wren had taught, that had been discussed at kitchen tables throughout the hollow for months, that had accumulated in reputation as the one specific and verifiable claim. Even Dalton's supporters found hard to dismiss, because they had eaten it or their wives had made it from Wren's starter, and it was undeniably particularly good. People who had been eating depression bread and the flat, dense survival loaves of households with too little fat and too little knowledge stood in the cave and ate Wren Calloway's sourdough, and some of them sat down right where they were standing. Not from weakness. From something more complicated, the sudden confrontation with the memory of what good food tasted like. The reminder that a meal could be an experience of quality in a decade that had stripped quality from almost everything. Grown men cried, quietly, not drawing attention to it because there was enough dignity left in the hollow, that even men who were being moved didn't want to make a show of it. But they cried, and everyone there saw it, and everyone understood it. Wren fed them all. She fed the people who had stood in their doorways and watched her walk north through the frozen yard and said nothing. She fed the women who had repeated Dalton's accusations in the churchyard. She fed the children of men who had been asked whether they could take in a 13-year-old orphan and had found reasons why they couldn't. She didn't ask for anything in return except what she had always asked that they learn. That they come to the kitchen days and stand at the oven and ask questions and take seeds home and plant them and teach their own children and their neighbors. That they understand not just the techniques, but the principles, so they could adapt when circumstances change, because circumstances in the hollow had been changing for a decade and showed no sign of stopping. She did not lecture them. She did not at any point remind them of what they had done or failed to do when she was 13 and needed somewhere to go. She stood at the oven and worked and talked about what she was doing and why, and she handed out bowls of whatever was ready. And she was exactly as patient with a woman who had been making the same pot of beans her whole life as she had been with Cobb Pruitt, who had cooked for 58 years. And still wanted to understand why things worked. "I don't want you to need me," she told a kitchen day group in the winter of 1938. "Pack in a canning jar to demonstrate the right technique. I want to teach you everything I know, and then have you go home and never need to come back. And then I want you to teach your neighbors the same thing." This was not how charity worked in 1938 or any other time. Charity worked by making itself necessary, by being the reliable external source that took on responsibility for people's needs, so they could remain in a sense dependent. What Wren was doing was the opposite. She was in the business of making herself unnecessary. By 1940, the operation had grown beyond what one person could manage without strain. The gardens stretched 300 feet along the terraced hillside. The goat herd had grown to 6, the chicken flock to 40. She had added a root cellar dug into the hillside lined with stone capable of storing several tons of root vegetables through the winter. The bread oven had been joined by a second, and the long plank table she'd built with Cobb had been extended twice. She was 20 years old, and she was running what amounted to a community institution from a cave on a mountain. And she was doing it largely alone. The man who changed that arrived in the late fall of 1939, driving a borrowed mule with a load of oak planks. Emmett Calloway was a carpenter from the next county, 24 years old. Quiet and observant in the manner of people who work with their hands and have learned to read the physical world with the attention other people give to the written one. He had spent 2 years at an agricultural college before the money ran out studying soils and drainage and the structural engineering of farm buildings, and he had come away with a practical education that complemented his trade. He had been hired to deliver oak planks that turned out on investigation, to have been ordered before Cobb Pruitt's death, and paid for from the same modest estate that had left Wren the cookware and the notebooks. He arrived at the cave clearing on a November afternoon with the low sun turning the limestone walls golden, and the smell of bread and smoked wood coming through the entrance. He stopped the mule and looked at what was in front of him. He looked for a long time, not cataloging it, but understanding it, reading the decisions in the construction. He saw the terrace gardens and understood the engineering of the retaining walls. He saw the smokehouse and recognized the quality of the stone mortaring. He saw the reinforced cave entrance and understood that whoever built it had thought seriously about load distribution. Then, Wren came out of the cave with a pot of something that steamed in the cold air, and she was 20 years old and had been running this place by herself for nearly 5 years. And he stood with his hat in his hands a moment before he said simply, "Do you need any help?" He stayed 3 weeks on that first visit. He built her a proper drainage system for the terrace gardens, cutting stone channels to direct the spring runoff away from the retaining walls. He reinforced the cave entrance with a timber frame that could bear weight, allowing for eventual construction above the entrance. He repaired the smokehouse roof and added the adjustable vent system Wren had always wanted, small wooden doors that could regulate the internal temperature. He came back in the spring and stayed through the summer, then went home for the winter, and came back in the spring again. The work between them was easy, in the way that work is easy when two people understand each other's approach and don't waste effort on explanation. He knew structural things she didn't. She knew food things he didn't. Together, the scope of what was possible was larger than either could achieve alone. At no point in this period did either of them say anything directly about what was happening between them. People who have important work to do often find that the work clarifies relationships without requiring conversation. And by the second summer, the question of what they were to each other had been answered in every practical sense, without anyone stating it. One afternoon in the summer of 1941, Emmett set down the plane he'd been using on a timber for the new dining hall frame and looked at her a moment and said, "I'd like to stay." She looked at him over the top of the bread paddle. "Stay for supper or stay permanently?" "Permanently, if you'll have me." She set the loaf on the stone table. "I'll have you, but I'm keeping my name." He smiled. "I was hoping to take yours, actually." They were married in September of 1941, in the cave with 60 people packed inside, and both bread ovens running and the smell of fresh bread and wood smoke, and autumn apples drifting out of the mountain for a quarter mile in every direction. The circuit preacher who performed the ceremony had heard about the cave kitchen from 3 separate families, and had made the climb specifically to see it. And he told his congregation afterward that he had never presided over a wedding that felt more like what a wedding was supposed to be. Not a ceremony, but a celebration. Not a formality, but the naming of something that had already been built. Emmett took his wife's name, becoming Emmett Holt in the marriage record, though most people kept calling him simply Emmett. He built a small cabin beside the cave the following spring. 2 rooms and a loft stone foundation, proper windows, a wood stove whose warmth reached every corner. It was the first real house Wren had lived in since her parents' cabin. She still cooked in the cave every morning as she had since December of 1934. Through the 1940s, the cave kitchen grew into something that resisted simple description. It was formally nothing, no organization, no charter. Wren had simply built something on a mountain nobody owned, and people had come to it. And over time, it had become the kind of thing communities depend on, without always being able to name the dependents. It was a cooking school where the curriculum was practical and the tuition non-existent. It was a food bank organized on the principle that the most reliable food bank is one that teaches people to feed themselves. It was a community center in the most literal sense, a place at the center of the community's life. By 1945, when the war ended and the soldiers came home to a changed country, Wren had trained more than 200 people in mountain cooking and food preservation. She had sent sourdough starters home with most of them, and those starters had propagated outward so that the wild yeast of Smoky Ridge was now present in kitchens throughout 3 counties, rising bread every day in ovens that had been cold for years before a 15-year-old girl had shown someone how to build and tend a living culture. Families that had been on the edge of starvation a decade earlier were now putting up their own food, growing winter vegetables, smoking their own meat. Not because conditions had improved dramatically. Conditions in the mountain communities of eastern Tennessee in 1945 were still genuinely hard. But because they had been given and had accepted and had practiced the knowledge that made the difference between surviving hard conditions and being destroyed by them. And then, in the autumn of 1946, Dalton Griggs climbed the mountain. He was 68 years old, and whatever he had been powerful, certain, absolute in his authority over the valley, he was no longer that. The ranch was gone, sold off in pieces over the previous decade to pay debts that had accumulated faster than a failing cattle operation could retire them. His wife had left him in 1943. His daughters had gone with her to Knoxville and started lives that apparently did not require their father. He had been living in a rented room above the old general store for 2 years in the building that had once been the commercial center of the Hollow, and was now simply a shell occupied by a broken man. He was not ill, not yet. He was just old and alone and diminished in the specific way of a man who had built his entire identity on the control he exercised over others, and who now, stripped of it, was discovering that he had built nothing underneath it that could stand on its own. He was not hungry in the catastrophic sense of 1934, that hunger was behind him, but he was hungry in the small, daily, dispiriting way of a man who cannot reliably produce a proper meal for himself, and who is lost through age and circumstance in the absence of anyone to cook for the motivation to try. He climbed the mountain on a Tuesday morning in October alone without telling anyone he was going. It took him 2 hours. The path was steeper than he remembered. His knees ached on the steep sections, and he stopped 3 times to rest. He arrived at the cave clearing in the mid-morning, when the autumn sunlight was falling through the turning leaves and making the limestone walls the color of honey. There were a dozen people in the clearing, women working the terrace gardens, a young man splitting wood near the smokehouse, children carrying water from the spring house, Through the reinforced cave entrance, the long plank table was visible, set with wooden bowls, and the smell coming out of the mountain was the smell that had been drifting down to the hollow on the wind for years. The one everyone in the valley, including Dalton, knew by now. He stood at the edge of the clearing and did not move. The people noticed him, you couldn't miss him. The former largest man in the valley standing at the tree line with his hat in both hands, looking like something considerably smaller than that. And a quiet passed through the group, a moment of collective recognition and collective waiting. Wren came out of the cave carrying a pot of bean soup, the steam rising in the cool October air. She saw him immediately and set the pot on the stone table without looking away from him. Then she walked across the clearing toward him. He looked at the ground when she stopped in front of him. The people in the clearing stayed very still. Later, every one of them would tell the story the same way, the same details, the same words. It was the kind of moment that fixes itself in memory with unusual precision, because it was the kind everyone present understood they were witnessing. Dalton Griggs looked at the ground and said, in a voice quieter and older than the one Wren remembered, "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything." He didn't elaborate. He didn't list the specific things he had been wrong about, which would have taken a while. He just said the sentence in the flat and simple way that men of his generation and his type sometimes say the hardest things without decoration, without cushioning, as bare as they can make it, and still get it said. Wren looked at him. She had been 15 the last time she stood in front of Dalton Griggs in that frozen yard. She was 27 now, and the years between had contained more life than most people accumulate in twice the time. She had built a kitchen out of a cave. She had fed hundreds of people. She had buried the closest thing she'd had to a mentor since her parents died, and married and built a home and planted 1,000 seeds in mountain soil and pulled 1,000 loaves from a limestone oven. She had thought about this moment in idle hours over the years, had composed various versions of the conversation, some of them satisfying in ways that did not reflect well on her, some more charitable. She had understood somewhere in the imagining that the version she actually wanted, the one truest to who she had become, was the simplest one, the one with nothing to prove and nothing to gain and nothing to take away. "Come in and eat, Mr. Griggs," she said. "The soup's hot." She walked back to the cave entrance, and he followed. And she sat him at the long plank table that bore in its surface the marks of thousands of meals, the rings of cups, the cuts of knives, the testimony of a table used hard and well for years. She brought him a bowl of bean soup with a piece of cornbread and poured him coffee from the pot on the hearthstone. She did not say anything else about the past, not then and not at any point afterward. Not a word of what had happened 12 years before. Not a reference to what had been taken from her or what she had built in its place. Not a claim for the recognition that anyone watching would have said she had earned beyond any question. She didn't need to. Every spoonful of soup was its own answer to every cruel and untrue thing that had ever been said about her in Hatcher Hollow. The bread answered for her. The cave answered for her. The 30 people who ate at her table answered for her. Their presence, their health, the knowledge that lived in their hands, because she had put it there. She sat at the other end of the table and ate her own bowl and talked to the people around her. And Dalton ate his soup in a quiet that he bore without complaint. And when he was done, he held his bowl in both hands a moment and looked at it. "That's the best bean soup I've ever eaten," he said to no one in particular. He became a regular at the cave kitchen after that. He came on Tuesday mornings and sat at the end of the table and ate what was offered. and spoke to whoever sat near him. At first rarely, then over months with increasing ease. He told people when they asked that Ren Calloway was the finest cook he had ever encountered, and that he had been a fool. He died in the winter of 1951, in the rented room above the old store with nothing to leave and nothing much to mark his passing, except that he had spent his last years at a table that would not have existed without him, that his cruelty and its consequences had become part of the foundation of the thing it was meant to destroy. Ren did not attend the funeral. She sent a dish of cornbread. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the cave kitchen's reputation moved beyond the mountains. In 1952, the state of Tennessee recognized Ren's work with a Community Service Award, which she accepted in Nashville in a simple blue dress, standing at a podium in a room full of people who had driven from across the state to hear her. She had not prepared remarks. She told them that the most dangerous form of hunger was not the kind that emptied your stomach, but the kind that emptied your knowledge, that left you unable to feed yourself because no one had taught you how, and that the best thing you could do for a hungry community was not to feed it, but to teach it. She was applauded at length and slightly puzzled by it, because she had said something that seemed to her entirely obvious. A Nashville newspaper ran a feature the following year under the headline, "The Cave Cook of Smoky Ridge." Emmett cut it out and framed it and hung it in the dining hall. Ren thought this was embarrassing and said so. Emmett said it was accurate and therefore not embarrassing. They discussed this point with affection and without resolution for the rest of his life. In 1963, a professor of agricultural science named Dr. Harlan Frost drove up from Knoxville and spent a week studying the cave kitchen's operation. The thermal mass principles of the cave's temperature regulation, the integration of fermentation and preservation practices, the productivity of the terrace gardens relative to their acreage. He went back to the university and wrote a paper that was published in a major agricultural journal and cited extensively in the field for the next 2 decades. He gave Ren full credit and sent her a copy which she read, with mild amusement at the vocabulary used to describe things she had figured out by feel and necessity, and filed in a wooden box under the stone shelf where she kept the things that mattered. Cobb's letter, her parents' photograph, the recipe notebooks. Emmett died in the spring of 1971 in the cabin he had built for them 30 years before, on an April morning with the window open and the smell of the ridge coming through it. He had been sick for 2 years, and Ren had spent them the way she spent everything. Paying attention, doing what was possible, being present for what was happening without pretending it was something else. She sat with him through his last night and talked the way she had once talked to her mother in the worst nights of 1934, describing forward rather than backward the seeds she was planning to start the new batch of cheese aging in the inner chamber, the way the morning light would hit the terrace beds in another 2 months when the angle changed with the season. He died at dawn quietly, and she sat beside him a while in the silence. And then she got up and went to the cave and built the day's fire and mixed the day's bread, because the bread needed to be made every day, and the only thing she had ever known how to do with grief was to keep working. Her daughter Ruth, who had grown up in the cave kitchen and knew its rhythms the way you know the place where your life was shaped, took on more and more of the running of the operation after Emmett died. She had her mother's hands, the same dexterous efficiency at the oven, the same instinct for what a dish needed. and she had grown up watching Wren teach, so she knew not just how to cook, but how to explain cooking, which is a different skill and not a lesser one. The 1970s brought a new kind of visitor. Young people from cities and college towns, part of the Back to the Land movement that had sent a generation looking for the practical knowledge their grandparents had possessed and that had been lost in the transition to supermarkets and processed food. Someone had written about the cave cook of Smoky Ridge in one of the movement's publications, and they came to see for themselves. Wren taught them the same things she had always taught everyone, with the same insistence that technique was subordinate to understanding. She was 60 years old, and she had no patience for the mystical framing some of them brought the notion that closeness to the land was inherently spiritual, that making bread was a transcendent act, that the cave was a sacred space. "The cave is not sacred," she told a group of visitors one afternoon. "It is well positioned for thermal mass, and it has good drainage, and it happened to be there when I needed it. The bread is not transcendent. It is fermented grain that I have been making for 40 years, and I know how to do well. The things I can teach you are practical. Take them home and practice them until they are practical for you, and then teach your neighbors." They wrote this down. Some found it disappointing. Most eventually found it more useful than any mysticism would have been. By 1979, the arthritis in Wren's hands had progressed to the point where kneading dough was genuinely painful. She spent a week trying modifications, and when none were sufficient, moved a chair to the bench beside the bread oven and sat in it while her granddaughter, Petra Ruth's eldest 16, who had been learning to bake since she could stand at a counter, worked the dough under her direction. She found in those mornings a different satisfaction than she had felt at the oven itself. The satisfaction of watching knowledge transfer, of seeing her hands' understanding become another pair of hands' understanding, of recognizing in Petra's movements the same qualities she had once recognized in herself: attention, patience, the willingness to let the dough tell you what it needed. "You're not making bread," she told Petra one morning. "You're developing a relationship with something alive. It will teach you things if you pay attention. Your great-grandmother told me that. She said bread was a living thing, and living things require tending." She paused. "She was right about almost everything, your great-grandmother. I'm still finding out how right." Wren Calloway died on a March morning in 1982 in her sleep in the cabin Emmett had built for them beside the cave. She was 82 years old. More than 300 people came to the funeral from every hollow and valley and county in the region. The women she had taught who had taught others, the families whose sourdough starters had descended from hers, the people whose cold frames and smokehouses and preservation methods had become simply part of how they fed themselves. Ruth ran the cave kitchen for another 15 years. When she retired, a nonprofit organization took over the work, and it continues to this day, teaching mountain cooking and sustainable food production, and the specific practical knowledge of how to feed yourself and your community from the land around you, which Wren Calloway understood at 15 and spent the rest of her life making available to anyone who wanted it. The original bread oven, the one Wren and Cobb Pruitt built in the cold February of 1935, mortared with clay and ash, cured with patient small fires over a week, that neither of them was willing to rush, still stands in the place it was built near the cave entrance, where the morning sunlight falls in a long shaft through the winter months. They fire it every Saturday. The sourdough starter that goes into the bread has been maintained continuously since the winter of 1934. fed every day without exception for nearly 90 years, passed from Wren to Ruth to Petra to the young bakers who tend it now, carrying in its culture the wild yeast of Smoky Ridge, the minerals of the limestone water, the particular and unrepeatable character of this specific mountain. People who eat the bread say there is something in it they cannot quite name, something mineral and sharp and alive, something that tastes of patience and of stubbornness and of the long, cold, specific knowledge of what it means to take a cave and a paring knife and a photograph of your mother and build from those materials something that feeds a world, something warm, something stubborn, something alive. When I think about Wren Calloway, I think about a girl standing in a frozen yard with nothing, no coat, no plan, nothing but a canvas bag with 2 books in it, a tin cup and a knife. I think about how the thing that got her thrown out, her love of cooking, her compulsion to feed people, her absolute refusal to make herself smaller than she was the exact same thing that saved her life and built everything that came after. I think about how the qualities Hatcher Hollow called worthless, the mountain called essential. And I wonder what you are carrying right now that someone has told you is useless. What knowledge, what skill, what way of seeing the world has been dismissed as impractical or excessive or simply too much? Because if Wren's story teaches us anything, it is that the things that make you different are almost never the things that are wrong with you. They are almost always the things that will matter most. You just have to find the right place to let them work. Every person who told Wren Calloway she couldn't cook was wrong. The proof was not in anything she said. The proof was in what she built, in the bread that came out of the cave every morning for 40 years, in the 300 people who stood in the autumn sunlight at her funeral, in the sourdough starter that is still alive today, still rising on a Saturday morning in a limestone oven on a Tennessee mountain, still carrying in its culture the particular and irreducible character of a girl who refused to be broken. Wren Calloway was thrown out with nothing. She built a kitchen in a cave, and from that kitchen, over the course of a long and serious and extraordinarily useful life, she fed a world. The best answer to the people who tell you that you can't is not an argument. It is the work. It is what you build. It is the bread.